To this screening. I don't mind that you don't have your cameras on now. We're just going to do introductions, but it would be lovely to have you present if you don't mind after we screen the film so that we can have a really intimate discussion. Anyhow, so again, welcome everyone to the screening and discussion of the documentary Black in Latin America. It's a PBS produced documentary hosted and written by historian Henry Louis Gates, which was produced in 2011. This is part of a 4-part series, which also includes episodes about Cuba, Mexico and Peru, and the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And it's based on a book that he wrote called Black in Latin America, published by NYU Press. Today's screening focuses on Brazil and the issue of whether or not Brazil is truly a, quote, racial democracy, end quote, as its forefathers characterized it to be. My name is Tamara Falikoff. I teach and research Latin American cinema studies here in Lawrence, and I'm so thrilled to be here. This is the second film in the series, and we plan to screen the remaining 2 films in the spring semester. This program was the brainchild of the Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month Planning Committee. And thank you to Alexa Smith, who is our digital docent tonight and has been doing a wonderful job getting the word out for these events. The format for this event is the following. We are going to be sending you a YouTube link in the chat box very soon. The documentary is 53 minutes, and we're going to give you an hour to watch it and then come back to our Zoom room. What I'd like to do now is introduce our speakers for whom I'll ask questions to, and there'll be time for you to ask questions as well. So just know that after you watch the documentary, we'll be able to speak more with Professor Chiquinho and with Juliana Camargo. Both are Brazilian. Juliana's living here and working at KU Med. And Professor Chiquinho is a professor who lives in Brazil, and we're really thrilled to have him with us today. Okay, I just wanted to get a reaction because I'm looking at my notes. What I'm most looking forward to is having to have you, the audience, see the richness of this documentary in all of its explorations of culture and how Black Brazilians and the influence of Africa has made a major impact on the culture, but often without an acknowledgement of their contributions to Brazilian society. The film will provide fodder for this discussion, and then our speakers will be able to speak firsthand about their experiences growing up in or living in Brazil. And I'll also ask them to compare their experiences living abroad. So in Juliana's case, her experience comparing race relations in Brazil versus the US. And in Chiquinho's case, Brazil versus his time when he was pursuing his educational aspirations in Portugal. So before we put the link in the chat, let me introduce our speakers. Professor Chiquinho's name is José Francisco Aparecido, but we affectionately call him Professor Chiquinho. He's a professor of education in Brazil, and both his undergrad and doctoral degrees were taken in Portugal. Having worked as an educator at all levels of education, he dedicates himself to the dissemination of art and its various languages as the main tool for an education of excellence in Brazil. What's really lovely is he was Juliana Camargo's teacher in arts and theater during her middle and high school years. And he's also an activist for Black Brazilian issues. It is such an honor to have him with us to speak on this topic. And again, we'll all have a chance to discuss and ask questions. I also want to introduce Juliana Camargo, and Juliana was the person who actually suggested that we offer this series as part of Latinx Heritage Month and research. So I'm very grateful to Juliana. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the exercise diet genitorial and endocrine research laboratory in the Department of Urology at the University of Kansas Medical Center. Her main research interests are diet patterns and dietary interventions to prevent and treat chronic diseases among underserved populations. And in the last 5 years, she's partnered and led global health research with medical teams in the US, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. All right, so the hope is, now that we've done introductions, is that we provide the link in the chat box, if not already. Here it is. And you can see the link to the film. It's 5:05 right now. So what I'm going to suggest is that we come back at 6:05. And what you can do is you can either turn off your camera, turn off your mute button, and keep this Zoom link going while you create a new tab and you watch the documentary that way, or you can just get off of Zoom and then come back on in 1 hour. So however you choose to do it, we'll see you back at 6:05. And I'd like to know before we do that, if anyone has any questions. Was that clear? Any doubts or questions? Okay, thumbs up. Thank you. I like that. I need some reaction from the group. All right, beautiful. So we will click on the link. Enjoy. I will tell you, I'm a film professor. It's amazing. I can't wait to talk about this film and then hear the perspectives of Professor Chiquinho and Juliana. So I'll see you in an hour. And I'm just going to turn off my camera and mute. All right. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye. The time we're supposed to. Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to convene now to discuss the documentary about Brazil as a racial democracy created by Henry Louis Gates. And hopefully you all had a chance to watch it. And this is our time to discuss. So I actually wanted to start off by speaking with Juliana and ask you, Juliana, about where you grew up in Brazil and your experiences there as it relates to this question about equality for African descended Brazilians and how that coincides, you know, some of the different debates that we saw, and just get a kind of a personal view from your perspective. And if you would like to compare it to your 5 years here in the US, based on your interactions, that would be lovely. It's up to you.
All right. So I grew up in a city in Brazil called Campinas. It's like 50 miles from São Paulo. And I grew up my entire life there. I just moved out of there to Kansas City. Growing up in Brazil, I think I need to share my background. So I'm from a family, as most Brazilians, mixed family. So my dad is more European descendant, and then my mom is from the northeast of Brazil. It's a mixed family. Um, so but we never talk about that at home. And then also like at school, I had different experiences. I changed a lot of schools in Brazil. So I studied in public school and private school. And in Brazil, that's also a way, in my opinion, that we see differences in race, because usually the public schools, depending on the neighborhood, you will see more the Black children and the mixed children. And then in the private schools, depending of where you study and how expensive is the school, it will be majority white. So I studied in a private school, and then I changed for a public school. And then was the first time I had the experience of having colleagues in my class that they were not white, because before everybody was white. All my professors were white. All my colleagues were white. So that was my first experience. And then also comparing to the US. And I think that was when I really realized the difference, because before moving to the US, I remember I had an interview with a professor, and she is Brazilian too. And then one of the things that she said, oh, in Kansas, you know, it's majority white. And then when she told me that, as Brazilian and growing up the entire life in Brazil, I was like, what does she mean for that? And when I moved to Kansas was my first time that I had the experience of being treated different, because I look different. In Brazil, because I'm white, I never experienced that. And I know that Brazilians that are not white have experienced that. And then after I went back to Brazil for the first time after being here in Kansas for 1 year, I could see that. And before I couldn't. So even I remember that I went to a restaurant and I started to notice that all the servers were Black, but everybody that was sitting in the tables were white. And then I started to question myself, like, why? And even how you are served in Brazil, how you treat a waiter, for example. it's completely different. And I started to question. And I remember that I would, for example, mention to some people in my family, and they're like, no, I think you're too sensitive because you're working with underserved populations in the US. I was like, no, it's because you're not paying attention. So it
Very
was the
interesting.
first time
Hmm.
that I that really clicked on me. I knew before, like from observing, and also, for example, what is showing the documentary in the favelas, that most of the people who live in the favelas are Black. But then in Brazil, even in research, they'll say, oh, it's social disparity. They never mention race. But in Brazil, the social and the race is very linked. But people don't say that because they're like, no, it's social. The problem is poverty. But who are the poor people? The majority. Um,
Okay.
so
Thank
for
you
me,
so
that
much.
was the experience. And I'm sorry if I talk too much.
No, no, you didn't. I think that's great. And it would be great to now get Professor Chiquinho's perspective. And I specifically want to ask you about some of the Black Brazilian voices that we heard in the documentary. You had different perspectives. Is there racial harmony? Is it romanticized? Is there racism? So there's this whole spectrum of debates around it. And at the very end, we heard about higher education and quotas, and I'm going to ask you about that later. But I would love to hear your perspective as a lived experience with regard to the documentary. What would you like to contribute to the discussion? Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody.
Oh, and by the way, Juliana is going to translate for Chiquinho.
Yeah,
He's going to speak in Portuguese, in Brazilian
yeah.
Portuguese.
But first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to speak at such an important subject. You know, I believe that I will be well interpreted by my dear former student Juliana. But I would like to share my experience in my own language, Portuguese. It's okay for you?
Of course.
Ok. Falar sobre o racismo numa visão brasileira é algo muito complexo. Primeiro porque nós temos no nosso país um histórico de miscigenação de diversas culturas que vieram ao Brasil pela colonização.
So talk about racism in Brazil. It's very complex because in Brazil we have a culture of miscegenation from different cultures from all around the world that came to Brazil.
Isso é muito importante nós entendemos primeiramente para conseguirmos entender o que é racismo estrutural.
So that's very important for us to point that first to understand what is structural racism.
Ou seja, os negros eles vieram para o Brasil como escravos.
So the Black people came to Brazil as slaves.
E nós tivemos vários séculos, né, de escravidão no Brasil.
And we had centuries of slavery in Brazil.
E depois, quando os negros foram libertos, nós tivemos um problema que se inicia agora.
So after the slavery ended in Brazil, there was a new problem issue that started in the country.
Ou seja, os negros foram libertos, mas sem direito a nada, sem direito à educação, sem direito à moradia.
So the slavery ended and Black people were set free, but they didn't have any rights. So they didn't have the right for a house, rights in the law in Brazil, in the education.
Ou seja, nós temos então o surgimento das favelas, como nós vimos no documentário.
So this is when it started the favelas in Brazil, as we saw in the documentary.
E há uma discrepância muito grande nessa realidade.
And there is a huge difference in this reality of the favelas.
Porque nós somos mais de 55% da população brasileira.
Because we are more than 55% of the Brazilian population.
Então, hoje, quando a Juliana fala sobre a dificuldade de encontrar professores negros nas escolas particulares, isso é fato.
So when Juliana said about how hard it was to see Black professors and teachers in the school, that's true.
Porque nós negros tivemos um trabalho duplicado para conseguir atingir uma posição social.
So we Black people had to double our effort to achieve a position in the society.
É muito diferente do que acontece nos Estados Unidos,
It's very different than what happens in the United States.
porque nós percebemos que os negros se uniram e fizeram universidades dos negros, como havia no Texas.
Because the Black community in the United States, they got together and started, for example, universities for Black people, like I saw on Texas when I lived there.
Uhum. E no Brasil, isso não aconteceu,
And in Brazil, that didn't happen.
porque o negro, nesse momento, ele é conhecido como alguém inferior.
Because in Brazil, Black people at that moment were known as someone that was inferior, like a second-class citizen.
Então, quando nós temos algumas políticas, no caso das cotas, para que os negros possam entrar na universidade,
So when we had like some policies like the cotas that we call in Portuguese for Black people to be able to have access to the universities,
há vários questionamentos sobre isto, porque alguns brancos acham que os negros estão sendo privilegiados para poder entrar numa universidade.
and there were a lot of questions because of that, because some white people thought the Black people were having advantage to get into the universities.
E isso não é verdade.
And this is not true.
No caso da a minha realidade, eu sempre estudei numa escola pública e comecei a trabalhar com 12 anos de idade.
Like on my reality, I always studied in a public school and I started to work when I was 12 years old.
E eu trabalhava numa multinacional chamada Robert Bosch.
And I worked in a multinational company called Robert Bosch. It's a Germany company.
Eu era office boy naquele local.
And I was what is called an office boy. And in Brazil, an office boy is a person that will run errands for the office, for administration.
E a pessoa que eu trabalhava, ela sempre disse, olha, você tem que estudar, você tem que investir no seu futuro. E eu levei isso em consideração. Então, sempre procurei estudar muito.
And the person that I work for, she always told me, you have to study a lot. You have to invest in your future, invest in your education. And I took that for me.
Ou seja, nesse momento eu fazia teatro e prestei a Unicamp, que é uma escola pública, mas eu não entrei. Por quê? Eu sempre estudei numa escola pública. Ou seja, há um disparate muito grande, porque você na universidade pública, você tem aquelas pessoas que estudaram em escola particular.
So I applied for a university in Brazil called Unicamp, that it's a public university. In Brazil, the public universities, they are free and they have the best education. So Chiquinho is saying that he applied for Unicamp for theater and he didn't got into that university because he always studied in a public school. So he couldn't achieve what they require to be in the university.
E não havia cotas naquela época, foi quando eu consegui uma bolsa de estudos para estudar aí em Tyler, Texas.
And at that time in Brazil, there were no program, no quotas for Black people to get into the university. So that was when he got a scholarship to do his university in Tyler in Texas, in the US.
Uhum. E nesse período eu trabalhei como voluntário no navio.
And at that time, he worked as a voluntary in a ship.
E foi quando eu visitei um local na África e me apaixonei por educação. Por isso que eu sou um arte educador hoje.
And when he was this voluntary in the ship was when he had the opportunity to visit a place in Africa, and he had the experience with education. And this is when he got passionate about education, and that's why now he works with education and art.
E com um trabalho praticamente de arte e de um trabalho missionário, eu consegui trabalhar e conhecer mais de 30 países.
And with this work, missionary work with art and education, is how he got the opportunity to visit more than 30 countries.
Mas só que eu me ingressei na academia, eu queria estudar mais. Foi quando eu fiz o curso de pedagogia, comecei a trabalhar com a escola, fui professor, coordenador e hoje eu sou diretor de escola.
But because he was so passionate about education, he went back to study more, and that's when he did faculty, University of Education, and he started to work as a teacher, professor, coordinator, so in different areas in schools.
E aí, nesse momento, eu senti realmente a questão do racismo.
And at that moment, when he started to work at schools, is when he felt close the racism in Brazil.
Porque eu já estava num outro nível
Because I
intelectual.
was in another intellectual level.
E são poucos negros que são reconhecidos nessa posição.
And there are very few Black people that are recognized, get recognition at that level of the society.
Uma experiência clara foi quando eu fiz um mestrado, ganhei uma bolsa de estudos pela mérito no Instituto Mackenzie, a Universidade Mackenzie, onde eu fiz um mestrado em Educação, Arte e História da Cultura.
So one example is when he got his master's scholarship at Mackenzie University, is a Presbyterian university in education. He got a scholarship for a master in education.
E eu era o único aluno negro.
And I was the only Black student.
Eu subi no elevador para ir para a sala de aula.
And I was in the elevator to go to the class.
A porta estava se fechando e uma professora queria entrar e eu consegui acessar para que a porta abrisse.
And the door was closing, and then I hold the door for the other professor to get in.
E ela disse, ainda bem que você trabalha aqui, você sabe como funcionam as coisas.
And then she said, oh, I'm so glad that you work here because you know how things work.
Mas eu não era funcionário, eu era aluno.
But I was not an employee, I was a student.
Então, quando nós falamos sobre a diferença, como eu morei nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil, quando a gente fala sobre racismo, o racismo no Brasil é muito sutil.
So because I lived in the United States and we talk about racism in Brazil, the racism in Brazil is very subtle.
Eu posso falar outro exemplo?
Can I say another example?
Eu moro hoje num bairro próximo ao Cambuí, que é um bairro de classe... Ai, Júlia, você explica aí, né?
So he lives in a neighborhood in Campinas. He's from Campinas as well. And it's a neighborhood like middle high class, so it's a wealthy neighborhood.
E muitas vezes eu sou confundido como porteiro do prédio.
Mhm.
And several times, like in the neighborhood, people think that I work as a janitor in the buildings.
E quando eu comecei a dar palestras sobre educação, capacitação de professores em vários lugares, eu fui até uma cidade, um hotel 5 estrelas.
So when I started to give like seminars about education, I went to a city and I stayed in a very good hotel, like a 5-star hotel.
E ao estacionar meu carro, o manobrista perguntou que time que eu jogava, porque ele pensava que eu era um jogador.
And when I parked my car in the valet in the hotel, he asked me like which soccer team I play in Brazil, because he thought I was a soccer player. Because in Brazil, soccer players are like Black people that are recognized as wealthy, as succeeded. Like,
ou seja, é uma realidade triste, porque nós temos menos de 15% de negros na academia, como professores que trabalham com pesquisa. E eu faço parte de um grupo desse.
It's a sad reality in Brazil because we have less than 15% of Black professors that are in academia in Brazil. We are not well represented.
E um país de mais de 200 milhões de pessoas.
In a country with where about 55% of the population is Black.
E quando você fala sobre a questão de doutorado e tudo mais, isso fica cada vez mais resumido, né? O número de negros.
And when you start to go even higher in education, like doctorate, for example, you will see even few Black people who achieve this degree in Brazil.
Agora eu vou deixar ela perguntar mais alguma coisa.
And I'll let you ask more questions.
Thank you, Professor Chiquinho. That was really informative. And yes, this is our time for you all who have seen the film and have been thinking about this. Maybe you know about Brazil, maybe you don't. let's ask questions or put questions in the chat. It would be great to have a conversation about what you just heard and how it, might be different from what you thought or what the situation is like in the US as a comparison.
Okay.
Okay, who would like to start? Okay, great, please. Yeah.
Hello. So I'm Jaime Perales. I'm faculty at the Alzheimer's Disease Center at KU. And I had a question for Professor Chiquinho.
Yeah.
I wanted to know about his experience in Portugal.
Oh, it's okay.
And how that connects to racism there and that kind of stuff. Thank you.
Very good question, Jamie. How are you doing? Muito bem. Eu completei 50 anos de idade e queria continuar a estudar.
So when I was 50 years old, I decided that I wanted to continue to study.
Foi quando eu prestei alguns cursos no doutorado em 5 universidades em Portugal e entrei nas 5.
So that was when I applied for 5 universities in Portugal and I was accepted in the 5 of them.
E 3 delas eu entrei em primeiro lugar.
And 3 of them, I was the first one to be accepted, like the first place.
Hoje eu estou cursando doutorado em 2 universidades, a Universidade de Évora e a Universidade de Coimbra.
So now I'm doing my doctorate in 2 universities in Portugal, in Évora and in Coimbra.
E algo que, Jamie, que eu percebi é que Portugal, eu tive vários professores negros.
So one thing that I realized in Portugal, Jaime, is that I had several professors that were Black.
Principalmente professores da Angola, São Tomé, ou seja, dos países colonizados.
Especially from African countries like Angola, São Tomé, like countries that were colonized by Portugal.
Very interesting. Okay.
E o que eu percebi...
Well, I just know that there are other questions. So maybe last point, Chiquinho, so more people can ask questions.
Very interesting.
Okay. Muki, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's
I'm sorry.
Mukui, but that's okay.
Mukui. Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
I was really fascinated by the sort of quota system that has been implemented at universities in Brazil. And I was somewhat curious about what the Black population or minority population in Brazil thinks about them, because here there's somewhat of a stigma if you come up through the education system. People can often think that you've only reached where you've gotten to because of the quota system, right? They think that you're kind of in what they call affirmative higher action. You're only here because of your race or because of your gender, because you're underrepresented. So I'm kind of curious if similar thinking has taken place in Brazil and how that's being counteracted if it hasn't.
Eu não entendi muito bem essa no finalzinho.
Ela estava perguntando do sistema de cota no Brasil, em como foi relacionado, né, no Brasil, como isso tem sido combatido e se tem isso também no Brasil como aqui, da pessoa achar que você só chegou na universidade porque tem cota.
Sim, no início houve um estranhamento muito grande com respeito a isso.
So when the system started in Brazil, there was a lot of people that was completely against it.
Em 2 aspectos. O primeiro aspecto é que as pessoas tinham vergonha de se declarar negro.
First, because people were ashamed to say they were Black.
E o segundo, pessoas que queriam aproveitar da situação e que não tinha nenhum parentesco negro.
And second, people that wanted to take advantage of that, even though they didn't have any Black heritage.
Então, existe essa discussão.
So there is this discussion.
Mas mesmo com as cotas, ficou claro para as universidades e para o governo que, mesmo propiciando essa vaga para o aluno que veio de uma escola pública entrar nesse lugar, ele precisa de mais apoio ainda.
So it was clear for the universities and the government that even though they had this system, they had to do more because that was not enough for the students to access the university.
O exemplo de um aluno que entra em medicina na Unicamp. Como que ele vai conseguir bancar esse período com os livros e tudo mais?
So one example is students that go to the medical school at this university that's very famous in our city called Unicamp. They get accepted, but then they don't have money to afford to live there, the books and all the extra costs that comes with the university.
Ou seja, nós temos a dificuldade de você... É aí que nós temos as diferenças das universidades aqui. Acho que é importante falar isso. Então, nós temos a universidade pública, a universidade que é a mediana, que é a particular, que seria a PUC, Mackenzie, e a popular, que seria a Anguera.
So in Brazil, we have 3 types of university that it will differ on the quality of education. So the best are the public universities that are free and it's harder to get in. The second are the private schools that have like a medium level of education and they are more expensive. And then we have the private universities that are cheaper, more popular, but the quality of education is not as good as the other two. So this is when there's a lot of changes. So then I'll share a little bit of my experience and she can explain very well. But when I got accepted to the university, first I studied in a private university that was like middle range. When I got accepted, it was when the quotas started. So it was when the new program started about 10 years ago. And then there was a lot of differences because especially a lot of white people, like they show in the documentary, would say, oh, but I'm losing my opportunity. Like, and they're just getting because of the color of their skin. What about everything that I studied? All my, the dedication and all that. And that is very unfair because you are not looking for the whole picture, but because racism is so sudden in Brazil, and especially white people sometimes never had contact. This is crazy, but sometimes white people in Brazil never had contact with a Black friend. Never, because all their environment, school, home, were all surrounded by white people, even though in Brazil, 55% of the population are Black. So they don't even understand why it's important to have that. They will only look for the merit, like, oh, they studied, I studied too, but they will not see that the education that was given to them is different than the education that some of other Black Brazilians had, and they didn't have the same opportunity before.
Thank you both for your comments, and these are excellent questions. So are there other folks that want to ask some questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm gonna ask em português, sorry.
All right, great.
Chiquinho, eu sou brasileiro também, eu estudo aqui na QU e tô fazendo meu PhD. Uma coisa que eu percebo... precisa traduzir.
Do you want to translate yourself or...
Você entende inglês também, né?
I do.
Yeah.
Então posso perguntar em inglês. I'm Brazilian. I studied at KU. I'm doing my PhD here. And one thing that I noticed, like that is the most different for me here, is that I don't know. I see like a unity in the Black population. So like you're Black. So for example, when I walk in the streets in Lawrence, or I came to school for undergrad in Nebraska, for example. When you walk in the street, when you see another Black person, the other Black person is gonna give you like a sign, or like they're gonna shake their hand. Like, in Brazil, I don't know. I see it's a different environment, and it's a different I don't know approach. I don't know how to explain, but this unit about the Black Brazilians, and I see how it is easier to fight racism here because no one's gonna say that racism is something from the last century here in the US anymore. But in Brazil, we even see the president and the vice president saying things like this. And you see my mom that is Black saying things like this, So this is I think for me it's the hardest thing, not just like when the white population does, they don't agree that racism is a thing, but when the black population is not still in agreement, that we have to fight for.
I understand. Bem, comparando os dois países, o que eu percebi nos Estados Unidos, em termos de racismo, você tem essa cultura do negro, a valorização do negro em todos os aspectos.
So comparing the two countries, what I noticed, like Brazil and United States, is that in United States, you have this agreement and you value some things related about being Black.
Então, por exemplo, na cidade você tem um bairro, que é um bairro dos latinos e dos negros. No supermercado você tem uma ala destinada a produtos de negros.
So what he saw in Texas, for example, you have neighborhoods that are usually like Black and Latino neighborhood. You have in the grocery store sometimes, you know, one aisle that is more towards food for that Black people consume more or Latino consume more.
Uhum. Então, agora, o Brasil, quando a gente fala sobre o racismo, no caso estrutural, é porque você tem a grande maioria da população negra e muitos dos negros não são unidos.
So when you talk about structural racism in Brazil, even though the majority of the population is Black, Black people in Brazil are not united.
Uhum. E isso é muito complicado porque desde na escola existe aquele diálogo que todos nós somos iguais.
And that is very complicated because since we have, like we start school in Brazil, we have this speech that we are all equal.
Mas na realidade, nós não somos iguais.
But in the reality in Brazil, we are not treated equally.
Nós temos necessidades, né, as necessidades fisiológicas e tudo mais, e essas questões que nos faz igual em termos de seres humanos.
So we have like our biological, physiological needs that are the same, that make us equal as humans, like biologically.
Mas a diferença que é necessário ser discutido na escola hoje. Por exemplo, eu sou casada com uma mulher branca, descendente de italiano.
But there are differences that we need to discuss in the school. So he's saying, for example, he's married with a white woman that she's a descendant of Italians.
E eu tenho duas filhas. Uma filha ela é mulata e uma outra, quando nasceu, era branca, igual a Juliana.
So, and he has two daughters, and one daughter, when she was born, in Brazil, we say, like she was, the term is different in Portuguese. We say brown, in Portuguese would be like mulata. And then his other daughter, when she was born, she was white like me.
E muitas vezes, quando eu estava com a minha filha, eles perguntavam se era minha filha.
So there are several times when he was with his daughter that was white, people were asking him if it was really his daughter.
Ou seja, ainda existe aquela cultura de negro tem que ser casado com negro e não ter essa questão do amor, do sentimento. Ainda existe isso dentro da própria comunidade negra.
So even inside of the Black community, there's this thinking in Brazil that Black people should marry Black people, that Black people shouldn't marry white people, and that if they're married, there's not the same love and engagement if they're from different race.
Thank you, Chiquinho. I wanted to end our session with a question from Terrence Stamps, who is saying that he's seen this documentary over 20 times, but is wondering if there's something that Dr. Gates missed that we can learn about being Black in Brazil. And I'll just say that one thing I noticed was after hearing about the incident on November 19th of an African Brazilian man who was attacked by security guards at Carrefour in Porto Alegre, Alexis actually sent me the article, so thank you for that. This was on the eve of Black Consciousness Day. So there are actually national holidays that are recognizing the contributions of Black Brazilians. And I was wondering, I wish that Gates had mentioned that because that's important. But anyhow, this is a question for both of you, Chiquinho and Juliana, if you want to answer. What's
Eu con-
missing?
Aham. Eu confesso que eu fiquei muito triste com esse episódio justamente no dia 20 de novembro, que nós comemoramos, né, o Dia da Consciência Negra.
He's saying he was very sad with what happened, especially because it wasn't the day of the holiday that we have in Brazil, that is November 20th. That's when we celebrate the conscience of Black people in Brazil.
Porque nós começamos a entender, infelizmente, da questão do poder. Nós temos um presidente que não acredita no racismo no nosso país.
So we started to understand things that happen regarding government and power in the country because our current president doesn't believe that racism exists in Brazil.
E essa fala muitas vezes motiva aqueles que têm autoridade.
And this speech motivates people who have the authority to do things like what happened.
E infelizmente em 2020 os negros ainda é considerado como inferior em todos os
So,
aspectos.
unfortunately, still in 2020, Black people in Brazil are considered inferior in every single aspect in our society.
Não importando qual é o seu nível de escolaridade. Na rua, ele é um negro.
And it doesn't matter how your level, your degree of education. In the street, you're Black.
Eu acabei de publicar na minha rede social um caso que aconteceu na Avenida Paulista, a principal rua de São Paulo.
So he just published a case on his social media about a case that happened at Avenida Paulista. It's one of the main streets in the city of São Paulo in Brazil.
Eu estava com a minha esposa e minhas filhas e passamos perto do MASP, que é um lugar cultural, e estava filmando as minhas filhas.
So he was at the Avenida Paulista with his daughters and wife, and he was close to a museum of modern art in Brazil, in São Paulo, called MASP. And he was taking pictures of his daughters and recording them and his wife.
E nesse momento, um carro de polícia veio na calçada na minha direção e eu fui questionado por que eu estava filmando aquelas meninas, de uma maneira agressiva.
And then there was a car of the cops that came to my direction, like from the pathway. They were not even in the street, and they stopped and started to question him why he was recording the girls.
Por quê? Por que será que essa pergunta foi feita?
And why? Why do you think they asked me that question?
Porque eu não era branco igual elas?
Because I was not white like them.
E eu publiquei isso e deu milhares de acessos de comentários.
And when he published that, there was a lot of people who started to comment and talk about it.
E mais um comentário que eu fiquei preocupado era que a pessoa disse o seguinte: eles estavam fazendo aquilo que tem que ser feito, eles não sabem quem você é. Você poderia ser um bandido.
But one comment that a person wrote on his page that he got very concerned is that the person said they were doing what they were supposed to do. They didn't know who you are, and maybe you were trying to rob them or do something against them. Yeah, and that's something that always happened in Brazil. It's not new. And in my opinion, what I think that he could have discussed it is about not having Black people represented in the levels of education, especially where white people are more. And that's why, for me, this moment is very special because I was telling Tamara that Chiquinho was my only Black professor that I have my entire life in Brazil. And I lived in Brazil for 27 years. And I studied in Brazil until a master. I just moved to the US during my doctorate. And when I moved to the US in Kansas, that even though people told me, oh, in Kansas, majority is white, and I know it is, but when I started at KU, I saw that the dean of my school is Black. I saw physicians that were Black. I saw other researchers that were Black, and I saw groups of studying research that was focusing like on Black communities. And in Brazil, I never saw that. And most of the researchers are white. And even though there are a lot of people that are compassionate, it's not the same when you see that you are represented. And I think if that could be discussed in Brazil, because to be honest, in my opinion, I think this is one way that the mentality in Brazil can start to be questioned. And then people start to realize when they see Black people doing the same thing that white people do, and not thinking, oh, they're a janitor, or, you know, they take care of elevators. And if that doesn't happen, it will continue the same, because white people will continue to live in their bubble. Like I lived in a bubble for a long time. I had to move out of Brazil to realize I was in a bubble. So I think that point, he could have discussed a little bit more about Black people being more represented at, you know, higher levels of the society.
That's what Gates should have said. Yeah, I understand your point. Well, listen, the two of you have been amazing. This has been incredibly edifying and enriching on so many levels. And I feel so privileged and grateful that the two of you have taken the time to express your experiences and helping us to understand more fully in a really wonderfully comparative way how, yeah, thank you. Great applause, virtual and otherwise. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Alexa for recording this. We will now have this as a document, and we can use this in our teaching, and we can share this with our colleagues. And again, thank you all for being here. I look forward to seeing you in future editions of these documentaries. I appreciate your questions so much. You're all so thoughtful, and our presenters are incredibly thoughtful. So thanks again, and have a good evening.